If you think you own an asset because your name is on a statement, a deed, or a government form, you are already standing in the wrong reality. In a real fiscal crisis, ownership is not what matters. Placement matters, visibility matters, jurisdiction matters, custody matters, and above all, what matters is whether your wealth sits inside the graph. I want you to hear that word the way an engineer hears it, not the way a politician uses it. A graph is a map of relationships, nodes and lines. Modern governments do not need to seize your life with soldiers on horseback. They govern your financial existence through a graph. Banks, brokerages, payroll systems, title registries, tax systems, property databases, retirement accounts, payment rails, transfer agents, custodians, reporting frameworks. Every modern saver lives inside this map and mistakes the map for civilization itself. Then the government goes fiscally hungry, then the arithmetic breaks, then the graph stops feeling like convenience and starts behaving like a feeding system. That is when people discover the ugliest truth in finance. You do not own what you think you own. You merely hold a claim inside an administrative structure that can be frozen, redefined, taxed, converted, delayed, surveilled, or quietly hollowed out the moment the state decides survival matters more than your assumptions. The source you gave me understands that truth very well. It begins with a dentist in Munich who believes he owns the ordinary symbols of a decent life, then watches emergency levies, frozen savings, gold surrender rules, and administrative power erase the difference between ownership and custodianship. It then runs across Germany, the United States, in 1933, Cyprus, Greece, Argentina, Venezuela, Lebanon, and a range of modern collapses to make one blunt point. When governments become insolvent, they do not disappear. They feed, and they feed first on the visible, the registered, the accessible, and the administratively reachable. The real question is not what should be safe. The real question is what exists outside the graph. That is the bone structure I am keeping. Fe turn 74 file 0 Fe. I want to build this the right way because the ordinary conversation about asset protection is usually childish. People ask whether the government could really do that. History says yes. People ask whether it would be legal. History says legality is among the first things rewritten in a crisis. People ask which assets are morally untouchable. Math does not care about morality. Insolvent systems do not become noble. They become hungry. So I do not want to talk to you like a salesman offering a product. I want to talk to you like a capital allocator who has spent a lifetime studying incentives, survival, and the difference between apparent ownership and survivable ownership. My frame is simple. I call it the administrative graph. If your asset sits deep inside the graph, it is easy to see, easy to regulate, easy to redefine, and easy to reach. If it sits outside the graph, or partly outside it, it becomes harder to seize, harder to convert, harder to freeze, harder to tax through one clean administrative motion. That is the whole game. Not is this asset good, not is this asset popular, not is this asset legal to own today, but how far outside the graph does this asset live? That is the adult question. And once you start asking it, the world looks very different. The first mechanism inside the graph is what I call the custody trap. Most people think they own money in the bank. Legally, they do not. The source says this plainly, and it is one of the most load-bearing truths in the entire document. Once you deposit money in a bank, you have made an unsecured loan to an institution. What you hold is not the cash itself. What you hold is a claim. That claim exists under a jurisdiction, inside a regulatory framework, under rules that can be altered in an emergency. Cyprus did not need soldiers to steal. It needed a weekend and a new resolution framework. Greece did not need tanks to take control of savings. It needed capital controls and access limits. Argentina did not need to physically remove dollars from every home. It needed to forcibly convert claims at an artificial rate. That is the custody trap. The asset sits with a custodian, and when the custodian becomes the point of policy intervention, your ownership becomes theoretical. Fe turn 74 file 0 Fe. That is why I always tell people that a statement is not an asset. A statement is evidence of a relationship, and relationships can be rewritten. You see a number. The state sees an accessible node. You see retirement savings. The state sees trapped capital inside a framework it already regulates. You see a brokerage balance. The state sees a set of administratively reachable claims that move through licensed institutions, audited rails, and tax reporting channels. That does not mean these things are useless. It means you must stop mistaking visibility for safety. The second mechanism is what I call the visibility tax. Governments do not seize what they cannot process efficiently. That is what the source teaches again and again through different historical forms. The point is not that every crisis looks the same. The point is that every crisis rewards the same trait in the state: administrative efficiency. The easiest assets to harvest are not necessarily the richest or the most moral or the most important. They are the most visible registered property, account balances, payroll flows, pension claims, brokerage assets, reported holdings. The graph tells the state where the meat is. Once a crisis becomes severe enough, the state does not need to send men door to door. It can move by decree, rule change, tax amendment, reporting threshold, conversion regime, withdrawal limit, or emergency levy. That is the visibility tax. The price of sitting deep inside the graph is that the graph itself can become the weapon. Fay Filocite Fay Turn, 74 file, 0 Fay the public, usually imagines seizure as a dramatic act. It is more often an administrative one. A levy, a bail, in a reporting change, a capital control, a forced conversion, a below inflation repression regime that quietly rots savings for decades while preserving the pleasant fiction that nothing was formally taken. That matters because it changes how you think. You stop asking whether soldiers are coming. You ask whether the graph is already complete enough to process your wealth without them. That is a more serious question. The third mechanism is what I call the human vault. This is where the source becomes much more powerful than a conventional financial article because it starts with the only asset category that has never needed a custodian, a title office, a bank holiday, a vault key, or a broker to exist, knowledge and skill. The source is right to put this first. Jewish professionals who fled Germany did not save their lives through balance, sheet cleverness alone. They survived because what mattered most could cross a border without declaration. A surgeon remained a surgeon. A physicist remained a physicist. A mechanic remained a mechanic. A software engineer today remains a software engineer wherever there is a market for code. That is, the human vault skills embedded in the nervous system are outside the graph in a way. Very few modern assets are. No executive order can freeze your competence. No bail. It can convert your diagnostic ability. No capital control can stop you from carrying language, pattern recognition, negotiation, repair skills, or medical knowledge across a border. Fay Filocite Fay Turn 74 file 0 Fay. Now, let me be precise about the distinction the source makes because it matters. Credentials are not the same as skill. Credentials are institutional paper. Skills are portable function. A law degree tied to one jurisdiction may lose value when you cross the ocean, but the analytical reasoning, language command, document fluency, client management, and strategic judgment developed through that process do not disappear. They can be translated into another form of value. A doctor may have to recertify. A welder may have to prove the work again. A teacher may need another channel. But the underlying productive power survived the state that issued the original badge. That is why the human vault is so important. It is the only asset class in this entire story that often becomes more valuable precisely when the formal system gets uglier. When currencies break, systems still need electricians. When banks freeze, children still need teaching. When governments become predatory, communities still need doctors, coders, translators, logisticians, growers, builders, negotiators, and people who can solve real-world problems. The graph can seize your claim on stored value. It cannot easily seize your ability to create new value. That is an enormous distinction. The fourth mechanism is what I call the physics wallet. This is the category most people think they understand, and only half understand portable physical stores of value held outside institutional custody. The source talks about gold, gemstones, diamonds, and portable dense wealth in a way that is historically grounded and structurally honest. Gold is not magical because people tell stories about it. Gold has certain physical properties: dense value per weight, durability, divisibility, no counterparty risk in physical form. Those properties matter. But the source's more important point is that the form and custody of the asset determine whether its structural resistance is real. Gold in a bank safe deposit box is still inside the graph. Gold in registered vault custody is still inside the graph. The same metal in your possession, unknown to the graph, is structurally different because administrative seizure now requires physical knowledge and physical access. The same logic extends to high-quality gemstones or other dense portable value. Their power is not moral. It is physical, small, hard to detect, valuable, movable. This is why I call it the physics wallet. Its resistance comes from the physics of the object, not from the promises of an institution. Faithful site Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. The source is also honest about the trade-off, which is exactly why I trust it more than simplistic gold propaganda. The qualities that make a portable physical asset resistant to administrative seizure also make it awkward in normal times. It is less liquid, it can be stolen, it can be lost. It can require expertise to authenticate. It can create legal and practical risk at borders or under declaration rules. That is not a defect in the analysis. That is the point. There is no asset that is liquid, visible, convenient, regulated, fully spendable, and seizure resistant all at once. Those properties fight each other. Anyone promising all of them in one instrument is lying. Fay file a site, Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. That is why mature allocators stop asking for perfection. They ask which weakness they are willing to bear in order to escape a more dangerous one. The fifth mechanism is what I call the memory key. This is the most novel part of the source because it highlights a category that simply did not exist before 2009 in this form: decentralized digital assets controlled by memorized seed phrases. Now, let us strip the ideology out of this and just study the architecture, which is what the source is actually doing at its best. The extraordinary property here is not price appreciation. It is not hype. It is not libertarian theater. It is that a store of value can, in principle, be reduced to words held in memory and recreated beyond borders without carrying a physical object or maintaining a conventional account. That changes the graph problem. There is no bank to serve an order to, no vault to open, no branch to freeze, no clerk to question. The source is correct that this creates a historically unprecedented form of seizure resistance. If the value is controlled by a key stored in your memory, then the graph cannot process it through its normal levers. Fay file a site, Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay, but again, this is only useful if you are honest about the trade-off. The source is admirably honest here. Volatility is violent. Technical mistakes are final. On ramps and off ramps are increasingly regulated. Governments cannot easily seize the decentralized asset itself if properly self-custodied, but they can absolutely make conversion, reporting, and usage harder. This is why I call it the memory key rather than some grand digital salvation. A key can open a door. It can also be lost. It can also open into a room that is hard to live in. Daily maximum seizure resistance often comes with maximum friction. That is a law worth remembering across all 5 categories. Faithful site, Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. The sixth mechanism is what I call the jurisdiction wall. The wealthy have understood this for centuries. Middle-class savers usually discover only after their own government has already begun feeding. The source lays out the logic through Argentina, Greece, Lebanon, Weimar, era capital flight, and modern examples of funds preserved simply by being held in a different legal domain. That is the essence of the jurisdiction wall. Administrative reach ends at the border, or at least becomes much more complex, much slower, and much less unilateral once assets sit under a genuinely separate rule of law structure. The source is careful to note that this is not about fantasies of secret villain banking. It is about legal, declared, compliant diversification of jurisdictional risk. A weak state cannot simply snap its fingers and directly administer what sits under another sovereign's law. That does not eliminate all risk. It changes the architecture of the risk. And architecture is everything in this conversation. Faithful site Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. I want to be clear about what this does and does not mean. It does not mean foreign equals safe. Cyprus taught exactly the opposite when people used a weak foreign jurisdiction as an escape from another weak one. It means that jurisdiction itself is an asset property. A bank account in the wrong country is still a graph node inside someone else's stressed machine. A bank account, trust, company, or custody arrangement in a genuinely stronger legal order creates a wall that the original government cannot unilaterally walk through. Walls matter. And if you have ever studied history seriously, you know that when states become hungry, walls are more trustworthy than promises. The seventh mechanism is what I call the human ledger. This is my favorite part of the source because it reminds people that survival is not just a financial event. It is a relational event. The source goes through Argentina's barter clubs, Soviet era and post-Soviet informal networks, post-war Germany, Hurricane Katrina, and other cases to make a point that no financial advisor earns a commission on. Social capital is one of the most seizure-resistant and collapse-resistant assets in human history. Trust reciprocity, reputation, favor networks, community integration, known competence, reliability, local goodwill. None of these sit on a bank server. None of them can be frozen by decree. None of them can be bailed in. None of them can be retroactively taxed through a keystroke. And yet in every collapse, they become spendable: food, work, safety, shelter, barter, referrals, help, protection. That is the human ledger. It is stored in the habits and memories of other people. Governments can administer accounts. They cannot easily administer trust. Faithfulosite Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. The source says, modern life, especially in developed Western systems, has eroded social capital for decades. That is one of the most important observations in the whole document, because it means modern people are not only deep inside the administrative graph with their money, they are also historically poor in the off-graph assets that would help them survive if the graph turns predatory. They are financially exposed and socially isolated at the same time. That is not just a vulnerability, it is a trap. Faithfulosite Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. And once you see that trap, you start realizing why this entire subject is bigger than investing. It is about how to live. If your whole life is inside visible systems, and you have no meaningful community, no transferable function, no trust reserves, no skills that travel, and no assets beyond easy administrative reach, then a fiscal crisis will not merely reduce your portfolio. It will reduce your options. And options are what wealth really is in hard times. Now let me pull this together the right way. The source says all 5 categories share one property. They exist outside the administrative graph. That is exactly right. Knowledge and skills, portable physical assets outside institutional custody, decentralized digital assets, foreign held assets in stronger jurisdictions, social capital. These are not one portfolio. They are not an investment allocation. They are a taxonomy of escape vectors. Each one sits outside the graph in a different way. One is invisible because it lives in the mind. One is portable because physics helps it. One is censorship resistant because code changes the custody problem. One is protected by jurisdiction. One is protected by human memory and reciprocity. None is perfect. All are structurally different from an account balance in a frozen node. That is what matters. Faithfulosite Fay turn 74 file 0 Fay. And that brings us to the identity shift. Most people still think like account holders. That is the old identity. They ask which institution they should trust, which product is safest, which percentage yield is better, which logo feels stronger. That is how graph-dependent people think. I want you to think like a graph architect instead. A graph architect does not merely ask what he owns. He asks where the node lives, who controls the rails, which permissions govern it, which jurisdiction defines it, how visible it is, how easily it can be reclassified, how much of it can cross a border in your head, in your pocket, in another legal order, or inside another human being's trust. That is a very different level of maturity. And maturity is what crises reward. Now, let me give you the practical operating system I would use if I were applying this source as a serious worldview rather than a dramatic essay. First, I would classify every meaningful asset I own by graph depth. Deep graph assets are those entirely dependent on domestic institutions reporting rails, and local legal control. Mid-graph assets are those partially visible but harder to process quickly. Off-graph assets are those that live primarily in skill, relationship, physical possession outside institutional custody, foreign jurisdiction, or self-custody digital control. Most people have never done this exercise. That alone tells you how unprepared they are. Second, I would separate convenience from resilience on my mind. The source is right that convenience and safety are often opposites. The most convenient assets are usually the ones sitting in the most complete graph. They are easy to use precisely because they are easy to see, easy to verify, easy to freeze, easy to regulate. That does not mean you should abandon convenience. It means you should stop confusing it with protection. Third, I would stop pretending that any single asset solves the whole problem. The human vault does one job, the physics wallet does another, the memory key does another, the jurisdiction wall does another, the human ledger does another. If you try to force one category to do everything, you become ideological. Ideology is expensive in crises. Architecture is better. Fourth, I would invest more deliberately in assets that do not show up on statements. This is perhaps the biggest blind spot in modern finance: skills, language adaptability, reputation, local goodwill, practical competence. These things have saved more human beings through real collapses than almost any brokerage product ever created. The fact that nobody charges a fee for telling you to build them does not make them less real. It makes them more ignored. Fifth, I would remember that governments do not need to be evil to become predatory. The source is correct on this point too. Insolvency is enough. An insolvent institution feeds because survival overrides principle. That is not ideology, it is math. A popular government can do it. A democratic government can do it. A well-intentioned government can do it. Roosevelt signed 6102. Japan silently repressed savers for decades. Argentina converted. Cyprus bailed in. Greece froze. Lebanon trapped. The moral tone of the government does not repeal arithmetic. Fe filocite fe turn 74 file 0 fe. That is the sentence I want lodged in your mind. Good intentions never change the math. Now I want to say something difficult. Most people will do absolutely nothing with this kind of insight. Not because it is wrong, because it is inconvenient. It forces them to admit that a lifetime of respectable, compliant, institutionally endorsed financial behavior may still leave them dangerously inside the graph. They do not want to think that. They want the system that made them comfortable to remain what it appeared to be. But comfort is not a defense. It is often simply the emotional experience of being deeply embedded in the machine that will process you later. That is why I do not measure safety by how normal something feels today. I measure it by how much of my life would remain mine if the rules changed next weekend. That is the real test. If the account froze, what remains? If the conversion order came, what remains? If the capital control arrived, what remains? If the wealth levy appeared, what remains? If the state started feeding on the visible graph, what remains? Those are the questions that matter. Not whether your portfolio looked diversified on Thursday. So here's the final mirror. If the next fiscal crisis arrives in the form history suggests it will, what percentage of your life exists outside the graph? How much of your value can cross a border in your head? How much can live in a tool, a language, a reputation, a trusted network, or a jurisdiction beyond the easy reach of the state? How much sits in claims that are only yours until the framework changes? How much of your confidence is really just dependence on administrative calm? And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, good. Discomfort is the beginning of honest architecture. That is the contract I would write with my future self tonight. I will stop confusing convenience with safety. I will stop counting only what appears on statements. I will invest in the human vault before I chase another visible yield. I will treat off-graph assets as part of resilience, not as fringe eccentricity. I will remember that jurisdictions matter, custody matters, visibility matters, and that trust stored in other human beings is more durable than most people think. I will ask before every major financial decision whether I am going deeper into the graph or building outside it. Because when insolvent systems feed, they do not start with what is hidden, difficult, portable, foreign, remembered, or relational. They start with what is easy. Do not be easy. That is the whole lesson. The people who preserve wealth and dignity in real collapses are rarely the people who had the most. They are the people who had enough in the right places. Be one of them.